The sun was a jagged brass coin hanging in a sky so blue it looked bruised, casting long skeletal shadows across the scorched earth of the Nevada Territory. Silas Thorne rode a horse that was as tired as he was, a rangy roan with dust caked into its coat and eyes that scanned the horizon for a shimmer of water that never came. Silas was a man of few words and even fewer attachments, his face a map of scars and sun-hardened skin, his eyes the color of flint. He had spent the last decade drifting through the blood-soaked dust of the frontier, a man who lived by the iron on his hip and the silence in his soul. He had heard of a small, forgotten homestead on the edge of the Sierras, a place where the dirt might still hold enough moisture to grow a life. He didn't want much, only a roof that didn't leak and a patch of land where the ghosts of his past couldn't find him. As the ranch house came into view, its timber bleached white by the relentless summer heat, Silas felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But as he drew closer, the silence of the valley was broken by the sharp, rhythmic sound of a hoe striking dry earth. He pulled the reins, his hand instinctively hovering near the holster at his thigh. The house wasn't abandoned. On the porch, 3 figures stood in the shimmering heat, their presence as unexpected as a rainstorm in July. They were Chinese women, dressed in plain, faded prairie dresses that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the American West. The eldest, a woman with a face carved from determination and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 miles, stepped forward. She held a heavy iron shovel like a staff, her knuckles white. Silas dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the parched grass. He didn't speak at first, letting the tension settle between them like the dust. He looked at the house, then at the women, then back at the road he had traveled. The youngest of the 3, a girl no older than 18 with a defiant tilt to her chin, moved closer to the eldest, her hand gripping the fabric of her skirt. The middle sister stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Silas with a mixture of fear and a weary, bone-deep resilience. "I was told this place was empty," Silas said, his voice a low rasp that sounded like grinding stones. He didn't move his hand from his belt, but he didn't draw either. He just stood there, a tall, somber shadow against the blinding light of the afternoon. The eldest woman, whose name was May, didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, though it carried the tremor of a long-held exhaustion. "The man who owned this land is dead. He died in the winter. We have been here since the spring. We have planted, we have watered, and we have survived. You are not the first man to come looking for a grave to call a home." Silas looked at the small garden patch, where green shoots struggled against the oppressive heat. He saw the way their hands were calloused, the way their dresses were stained with the red clay of the hills. They weren't just squatters, they were survivors. "I'm not looking for trouble, ma'am," Silas replied, his eyes softening just a fraction. "I'm looking for a place to rest. My horse is spent, and I've got no more trail left in me." May looked at her sisters, Leanne and Zhao, and then back at the stranger. He didn't look like the raiders who sometimes passed through, men with hollow eyes and hungry smiles. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had finally decided to turn his back on it. "You can stay in the barn," May said, her voice dropping the sharp edge of its defense. "But you stay away from the house. And you earn your keep. Water is scarce. If you want a drink, you dig." Silas nodded once, a gesture of solemn agreement. He led his horse toward the weathered barn, the wood groaning under the weight of the sun. He didn't know their story, and they didn't know his, but in the harsh reality of the frontier, survival was a language they all spoke fluently. The first few days were a test of endurance and unspoken boundaries. Silas spent his hours clearing the irrigation ditches that had been choked with tumbleweeds and silt, his muscles aching with a familiar, grounding pain. He watched the sisters from a distance, observing the quiet efficiency of their movements. Leanne, the middle sister, was the one who brought him a tin cup of water in the heat of the noon sun. She didn't speak, only handed him the cup with a steady hand. Her eyes were observant, taking in the way he worked without complaint, the way he treated his horse with a gentle reverence. Silas found himself wondering how 3 women had ended up in this desolate corner of the world, so far from the bustling streets of San Francisco or the mining camps of the north. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and painted the sky in shades of violet and bruised orange, Silas sat on the porch of the barn, cleaning his boots. May approached him, her shadow long and thin on the dirt. "Why are you here, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice quiet but piercing. "A man with a gun like yours usually has a purpose, and that purpose usually involves blood." Silas didn't look up. "I've had enough purpose to last 3 lifetimes, May. I'm just looking for a bit of peace. Is that so hard to believe?" May sat on the edge of a crate, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "In this country, peace is something you have to fight for every single day. We came here because we had nowhere else to go. Our father worked the mines until his lungs turned to stone. When he died, the creditors took everything but this scrap of dirt. They thought we would wither away and die in the heat. They didn't realize that we are like the sagebrush. We have deep roots." As the weeks bled into a month, the initial suspicion began to thaw, replaced by a fragile, mutual respect. Silas found himself doing more than just the heavy lifting. He began to repair the sagging porch, fix the broken shutters, and reinforce the corral. In return, the sisters shared their meager meals with him, bowls of rice and wild greens, seasoned with herbs they had managed to grow in the shade of the house. Zhao, the youngest, began to lose her sharp edge of defiance, occasionally asking Silas about the world beyond the valley. "Is it true the cities are made of stone and light?" she asked one evening, her eyes wide with a longing she couldn't quite hide. Silas shook his head slowly. "They're made of noise and greed, Zhao. There's more beauty in a single sunset out here than in all the streets of New York." "But beauty doesn't feed you," Leanne interjected, her voice pragmatic. "Beauty doesn't stop the men who come looking for what isn't theirs." She was right, and they all knew it. The peace they had found was a thin glass skin, easily shattered. The threat came not from the land, but from the greed of men who saw the valley as a prize to be taken. A local land baron, a man named Miller who owned the water rights to the neighboring territory, had been eyeing the homestead for years. He wanted the spring that sat at the edge of the property, the only reliable source of water for miles. Silas had seen Miller's men riding the ridgeline, their silhouettes dark against the sky. He knew it was only a matter of time before the quiet was broken by the sound of hooves and the smell of gunpowder. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday, when the heat was so thick it felt like a physical weight. 3 riders descended from the ridge, their horses kicking up plumes of white dust. At the lead was a man with a silver-plated vest and a sneer that seemed etched into his face. He pulled up in front of the house, his eyes raking over the women before settling on Silas, who stood by the well, his hand resting casually on the handle of his revolver. "This land belongs to the Miller estate now," the man announced, his voice booming with unearned authority. "You ladies have 24 hours to pack your things and move on. As for you, drifter, I'd suggest you start riding now if you want to see the sunrise." May stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "We have the deed. This land was bought and paid for by our father. Miller has no right to it." The rider laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "Rights don't mean much when you're buried 6 feet under, sweetheart. Miller wants the water, and what Miller wants, he gets." Silas stepped into the light, his presence suddenly filling the space between the riders and the porch. He didn't raise his voice, but the intensity in his eyes made the lead rider's hand twitch toward his holster. "The lady said they have the deed," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "That means they stay. And if you want the water, you're going to have to go through me to get it." The rider sneered, but he saw the way Silas stood, the balance, the stillness of a man who had killed and was prepared to do it again. "We'll be back," the rider spat, wheeling his horse around, "and we won't be coming to talk next time." As the dust settled, Silas looked at the three sisters. Their faces were pale, but their eyes were resolute. They didn't ask him to leave. They didn't ask him to stay. They simply stood together, a family bound by blood and hardship, facing a storm they knew was coming. Silas felt a surge of a long-forgotten emotion, a sense of belonging, a need to protect. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was a man with something to lose. The following morning the air was unnaturally still, the kind of heavy silence that precedes a mountain storm. Silas spent the early hours cleaning his sidearm, the rhythmic click of the cylinder the only sound in the barn. He didn't have to look at the house to know the sisters were watching the horizon. They had spent their lives being told they didn't belong, that their presence on this soil was an affront to the men who sought to carve the West into private kingdoms. May walked into the barn, her shadow crossing his workbench. She wasn't carrying a shovel today. She was carrying a heavy leather satchel. Inside were her father's legal papers, brittle and yellowed, but signed with the seal of the territory. "They will burn the house to get these," she said, her voice devoid of its usual iron. "They think because we are women, because our skin is different, that we will simply vanish into the sagebrush." Silas looked up, the light from the barn door catching the hard line of his jaw. "I've spent my life running from things I couldn't change, May. But I'm tired of running. This dirt might be dry, but it's yours. If they want it, they'll have to pay a price they can't afford." May reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before she pulled back, a rare moment of vulnerability flickering in her dark eyes. "Why do you care? You could be 10 miles away by noon." Silas stood, holstering his weapon with a final, decisive snap. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I'm standing on the right side of a fight." By midday, the heat shimmered off the flats like a sea of mercury. Silas moved with a grim, purposeful energy, positioning himself behind the low stone wall of the well house. He had instructed the sisters to stay inside the main house, barricading the doors with the heavy oak table. Leanne had protested, her eyes flashing with a defiant fire. "We are not sheep to be protected," she had hissed. But Silas had held her gaze until she saw the logic in his strategy. He needed them safe, so he could be dangerous. The sound of hooves finally broke the silence. Not 3 riders this time, but a dozen. Miller hadn't sent messengers. He had sent an army. They came in a wide arc, their silhouettes jagged against the blinding sun. At the center was Miller himself, a man whose wealth was built on the broken backs of those he deemed lesser. He didn't stop at the gate. He rode straight into the yard, his men fanning out like a pack of wolves. "Thorne!" Miller shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Step out and we might let you live. The women go to the labor camps in the north. The land goes to me. That's the only deal you're getting." Silas didn't answer with words. He rose from behind the stone wall, his movements fluid and precise. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the afternoon stillness. Miller's hat spun off his head, a warning shot that spoke louder than any threat. The yard erupted into chaos. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and thick, stinging Silas's eyes as he ducked behind the well. He fired with a cold, mechanical efficiency, each bullet finding a mark not to kill, but to disable, to drive the invaders back into the dust. He saw a man move toward the porch with a torch, the flame licking at the dry air. Silas didn't hesitate. He pivoted and fired, the torch falling into the dirt where it sputtered and died in the red clay. From the windows of the house, he heard the sharp crack of a hunting rifle. May and Leanne were not sitting idly by. They were firing from the shutters, their aim steady and true. They were fighting for their home, for the memory of their father, and for the right to exist in a world that wanted to erase them. The sound of the battle was a cacophony of screams, neighing horses, and the relentless hammer of lead against wood. Silas felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't falter. He saw Miller rallying his men for a final charge, their faces twisted in a mixture of greed and fear. They hadn't expected a fight like this. They hadn't expected a broken-down farm to be defended by a ghost and 3 women who refused to break. Silas stood his ground, his heart beating with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. This was the redemption he had been searching for in the bottom of 1,000 whiskey bottles and across 1,000 miles of lonely trail. The tide turned when Miller's horse bolted, spooked by a well-placed shot from the porch that struck the ground between its hooves. The leader tumbled into the dirt, his fine clothes stained with the very earth he sought to steal. Seeing their employer fallen, the remaining hired guns lost their stomach for the fight. They were men who fought for coin, not for conviction, and there was no amount of gold worth dying for on a nameless patch of Nevada dirt. They turned their horses and fled back toward the ridge, leaving Miller groveling in the dust. Silas stepped out from behind the well, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his shirt soaked with blood and sweat. He walked toward the fallen man, his shadow falling over Miller like a shroud. "You've got 2 choices," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "You can leave this valley and never look back, or I can bury you in the hole you tried to dig for these women." Miller looked up, seeing not just a gunman, but a man who had found his soul again. He didn't say a word. He scrambled to his feet, caught a stray horse, and rode as if the devil himself were at his heels. Silas watched him go until he was nothing more than a speck of dust on the horizon. Only then did he allow his knees to buckle, the adrenaline fading to leave a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. The resolution did not come with a parade or a grand speech. It came in the quiet, rhythmic pace of rebuilding. In the days that followed, the sisters tended to Silas's wound with a tenderness that made his throat ache. They worked together to patch the bullet holes in the siding and clear the spent casings from the porch. The summer heat began to break, replaced by the cool, crisp air of a coming autumn. One evening, as they sat around the small wooden table, sharing a meal of stewed beans and fresh bread, the silence was no longer tense. It was a shared peace, a hard-won sanctuary. "We should start on the north fence tomorrow," May said, her eyes meeting Silas's across the flickering candlelight. "If we're going to run cattle, we need to be ready before the first frost." Silas nodded, a slow smile touching his lips, the first real smile he could remember. "We'll need more supplies from town," he replied. "I'll ride in at dawn." Zhao looked up, her expression bright with a new kind of hope. "Will you bring back some flower seeds, Silas? The ones that can survive the winter?" Silas looked at the 3 women who had become his family, his anchor in a world of shifting sands. "I'll bring back everything we need, Zhao. Everything." As the moon rose over the Sierras, casting a silver light over the resilient little farm, Silas Thorne finally knew he was home. The drifter had found his destination, and the outsiders had found their strength, united by the red dirt of a land that finally belonged to them.